Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As we are three-quarter way through our conference, we have 1 hour, and we call this our concluding remarks. So I will try to use this hour, not by delivering another lecture, but to talk about two issues. The first one is what we have achieved and what we have missed or slipped through the net because of all sorts of reasons, what we haven't talked about. The second thing is I want to talk about practical issues, as is the norm. After every conference, we could either go back to our institutions, continue our lives, forget about it. We have gained access to each other, we've met each other, we love each other's company, but I think it's our responsibility, the organizer, to start thinking about making the conference papers available to a wider public. And as a record of our meeting that other scholars and wider audiences could benefit from. So let me just talk about the first issues. But we actually, we are very, very grateful to all of you who participated in the conference, sent your papers. I made a decision throughout the last 2 weeks not to circulate the papers to us, the speakers, for important reasons. Some people sent me their papers and they said specifically, please do not circulate. Others sent their papers because I pressurized them and the papers are not finished. Whereas some other papers were perfect. They could just go straight into the publishing packet. So because of this, and I understand it was a difficult time, November is not an easy month for quite a lot of people, they're in the middle of teaching, so they didn't have time to finish their papers and send them to me. So I thought you have 20 minutes to present, and the discussion, the chairs will have to rely on your oral presentation. Throughout the last 24 hours, I had heard questions, and the answers are really in the paper. I've seen it because I've read all the papers, believe it or not. So yes, we have covered a lot. As in all conferences, we try to group these papers in panels. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But I think given we are 14 people presenting 14 papers, what will happen eventually is we are thinking in terms of grouping them in three sections of an edited volume. And here I'm presenting this to you, so you give me feedback or suggestions, and I'm happy to consider your thoughts. But we talked, one theme that was really important was state-society relations in Saudi Arabia. And it's a very broad one. For example, Greg started us by looking at the state, at the regime, and its own survival mechanism strategies. And he comes from a well-established political science tradition that looks at the state and its strategies. So that's a legitimate political science view that we'd like to include, and also it was distinguished by its clarity, and also by the way Greg tried to position himself as not a deterministic, that this is what worked in the past, doesn't necessarily mean it will work in the future, if I understood your paper, Greg. So that will be the opening chapter for our edited volume. The Hijaz in perspective was, I thought I would get a paper to talk about notions of statehood in Arabia prior to 1932. So I might work with Malik to get that kind of perspective. Not simply to say that, there were other state models in the region, but to show that that critical moment between 1916, 1932, there are other options. So it gives us some historical depth, and it's something that hasn't been done in the context of looking at Saudi Arabia. It has been done in the context of the Arab Revolt and the Ottomans. I think in terms of an absolute monarchy, succession is extremely important. This is why I felt like we need to have a chapter on succession and look at what really happens in Saudi Arabia in the event of a power struggle or in the event of a vacuum up there somewhere. So this is extremely important and relevant. Stefan told us about state-society relation, but from an economic point of view, from the perspective of how the redistribution capability of the state had influenced state-society relation in basically half a century or more. So it is important to get that economic solid dimension that is anchored in oil, and also in benefits and other issues that had accompanied the oil boom in Saudi Arabia. And he promises to bring the story to the vision, the recent Vision 2030, and also have the question posed about what happens to the Saudi regime when its resources dry up. Of course, we don't want to make predictions. We don't want to forecast the downfall of the House Saud, as I mentioned early on in my first welcome note. We want to make it open for discussion, I think. And then we, at the same time, if we think that oil had pacified the population, we have Rosie's paper popping up like this and saying, look, oil allowed the state to redistribute, but it was actually oil that allowed some kind of unusual mobilization in a country like Saudi Arabia. So we don't want to assess that historical moment from the perspective whether it was like a tiny minority or a small cell here and there, but it was an important historical moment that allows to question oil for loyalty equation, okay? What is known as the rentier state model. So that's extremely an important perspective. Then we have Sultan Al-Amir, who would be the sixth sort of paper or chapter in this volume, telling us about revisiting studies of the recent in the meaning like in the last 13 years or so, contestation in two different parts of Saudi Arabia, two different cities. And he argues against the common wisdom that had dominated Western scholarship about Saudi Arabia, in the sense that we look at the Shia of Saudi Arabia, the Qatif, as a separate form of mobilization. You can trace it to the early times of Rosie's historical moment, where the Shia were communist or Ba'athist or Nasserite, intermingling in the oil camp. Yeah? And then from the late 1970s, early 80s, we have a shift towards a Shia sectarian identity. So basically, this scholarship looks at this kind of mobilization as a separate mobilization from the one we see in other parts of Saudi Arabia among the Islamists. And in a way, he's right that the agenda of Western scholarship is determined by security issues sometimes, and in fact, I would say most of the time. But if you want to have a grant from a US grant-giving institution to study poverty in Saudi Arabia, so my colleagues, please try that and we'll see whether you're successful. However, if you want to study IS, you might actually get quite a lot of support. So let's not kid ourselves. Knowledge in most part of the world is dictated by certain political issues. And therefore, the Islamist mobilization is regarded as part of Islamism, of jihadism, of security, of terrorism, etc. So his approach tries to dissolve these boundaries and give us a different approach that looks at regionalism, whether we agree with him or not, but it's an alternative way of thinking about two separate issues so far in the literature on Saudi Arabia. So that's state and society. Then I think what I would like to do is have a part two to our presentations. This part two will look at Saudi Arabia and transnational religious connections. So in a way, we will start this section by looking at this word Salafiyya and problematize it in the work of Andrew Hammond, who looks at its genealogy. We think that all Salafis think we've been there since time immemorial, but he looks at it as a modern phenomenon, especially when it becomes a political identity, rather than simply about la madhabiyya or madhabiyya debates within theological circles. Then we move on to the institution that is, in the eyes of many people, is responsible for galvanizing the world. I mean, the University of Medina, if you look at the literature, so we understand that some people want us to believe that anybody who goes there ends up as a jihadi, Salafi, radical, sectarian, etc. But I think in his work, in Michael's previous work and his book that we will discuss later, he problematizes this simplistic mode. Sort of like, somebody goes to a Saudi university, comes up a jihadi, it's a bit sort of too much, too simplistic. So he looks at, again, the literature that says that Saudi Arabia is responsible for transnational Salafiyya and looks at the accused institution and comes up with perhaps different conclusions from what we hear in the media. Then we go to the heart of what is on the mind of many people, and this is Wahhabiyya and the Islamic State. If you read the American press and other press, it's like, today there is in the mind of so many people that IS is actually a Wahhabi version that had traveled to Iraq. The fact that they put the books of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabiyya, on their curriculum attest to the connection between the two. Right. So what Paul Bunzel makes us see is some kind of intellectual connections that are by non-state actors with state support or completely outside state control. So his work shows us how certain religious figures in Saudi Arabia may have influenced certain kind of jihadi trend. But he makes a very interesting point about how there is a Wahhabization of jihad, and we have seen this with ISIS, rather than with the previous trends, such as perhaps Al-Qaeda, where there was a mutation of Islamist thought taking place in Afghanistan, from the Qutbis to the Muslim Brotherhood to other groups. So we look at the intersection, how certain trends had become possible simply because of easy travel, of people moving from Bahrain, studying with Saudi scholars, then going to Iraq. Makes us think that it's really difficult to apply some models that talk about Salafiyya as there is the quietist branch, the activist political branch, and then there's the jihadi one. So Abdullah ibn Jibreen, one of the religious scholars he talks about, so he is regarded as a radical Salafi scholar who inspires the ideologue of ISIS, but again, the Saudi king telephones his family when he dies. So the interconnection are more complex than what we normally think. Then Nadab talks about how this IS phenomena is intermingling with local cultural issues. And he introduced us to a kind of special nationalism. He calls it kin nationalism, that is so important in a country like Saudi Arabia. And it is not a product of the persistence of tribal identities and genealogies, as some sort of previous generation of Orientalists wanted us to believe. But he shows how this is a state strategy. This is how citizens, of course they're not citizens, but they are members of tribes, relate to the state and the state relate to them, which enforces this genealogical narrative that they all cling to. And then we have an added dimension, the Islamic State appeal, or wanting to appeal to Saudi constituency. So it is the intersection of this sort of tribal genealogical tradition with Islam. And one is very peculiar, particularistic, and one is very sort of global, universal. And IS is facing the same challenge that the Saudi government faces, trying to combine these two trends in a modern nation state, in inverted commas. Then we move to foreign relations, which would be our last section, and we take the story from the Cold War, and I think Toby makes a very, very clear argument to start thinking about contemporary debates about Islam, radical Islam, or Islamic extremism. All these terms that had become so common that we use, he shows us, based on his documented sources, how Islam was instrumentalized in the Cold War, and Saudi Arabia played an extremely important role in this instrumentalization. And I think this is extremely important because we already know that the Saudis cooperated and Wahhabiyya was co-opted and used by the Pakistanis and the Americans and the Saudis themselves. But at least here we have the case put in a historical chapter about the role Islam played in defeating the Soviet Union and the pivotal role of Saudi Arabia. Then we have a sweeping sort of survey of Saudi regional approach and how it is new, and the conclusion is that we might think it's new, but with just one exception, and that Neil gave the case of Yemen, that we see really not a great change. There is continuity, but perhaps there is more rhetoric at the moment. And it would be interesting to follow Neil's paper and see why is there more rhetoric, firing rhetoric. Is it really for the outside world, or is it for the domestic audience? Why he uses MBS as the champion of a new war, the hero of decisive storm, the war in Yemen. What does this rhetoric serve, and who is the target or the audience of this rhetoric? Which may have allowed some scholars to think that there is a shift, a massive shift in Saudi foreign policy. So, and then finally we have two really interesting papers on China and Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, again, part of their rhetoric, they wanted us to believe that there is a shift towards Asia now. They're abandoning the US and developing intimate economic relations with China and perhaps India as well. And this was documented in several high publicized state visits to China and backward and forward. But I think the two papers concluded that at the moment it's just economics. It's oil, trade, and perhaps like 600 students sent to China from Saudi Arabia. So I think I sense that both chapters confirm what Gregory said, that America is still the superpower as far as the Saudis are concerned. And it seems like since that sort of glorified alliance, after the Second World War, the relationship is so deep that it is very difficult to disentangle one from the other. So I think that this is what I envisage the book to be, based on reading your finished and near finished and papers. So if you have any comments, I would like to hear your views as you also listen to all the papers, and I'm happy to accommodate them, respond to them. In terms of the timetable, before I let you give me your feedback and comment, is I would hope that, first of all, I will send you an email, possibly over the weekend. I don't want to harass you when you're just returning. It will take you 2 days at least to get back home. And I will send my email after. I will not be in Singapore after the 23rd of December, so I will be contacting you from London with my LSC email. And I may have some specific comments to each one of you. I will send them, and then I would propose that we have the 15th of January as the final date for you to send me your final version. And also I will send the style sheet of the publisher, because we've already got the contract with the publisher, which will help you format your paper according to their specification. If you send me the paper in a completely different format, it will take us longer to publish and get them ready. So this is all I have to say. Aung San, would you like to say a word before we hear from our colleagues?
Thank you, Madawi. After Madawi's summary of all the papers and the plans to put it in the book, I think Madawi has drawn together the themes and topics of the conference very well in the way she's put together the presentation. So I won't really comment on that at all. I would say congratulations to all of you for presenting such fine work, which to me seemed together give me a different view of Saudi than I have in the past. And this is a view I would say is one in which we start with domestic, regional, and international, but I think in many of the papers, what we see is parts or aspects of Saudi Arabia poking out from beyond the domestic space. So we know today that we want to move beyond nation states. We want to move beyond borders, and most of the papers show very well how in each of those dimensions, whether it's kinship, whether it's notions of Salafism floating around, whatever it is, there are all these things poking out of the nation state, which are present together in the state in a very dense way. So I think perhaps the theory in IR or in social theory hasn't really caught up with this sort of view, but I think what you've put together today really gives us the basis for having the material and the forms and shapes of the material to think about how a domestic space is in interaction with an international space, I would say, from the beginning. And in that sense, Saudi is very interesting because it is one of the few countries in the non-Western world which in the modern period has not been colonized. And I suppose earlier than the modern period as well. This includes countries like Thailand near here. And I think this group of countries which have never been colonized present interesting cases for us to think about how to do transnational work and relate it to domestic work. And I think one of the things about these kinds of countries, Saudi Arabia and Thailand, is they have not been colonized precisely because they are very smart in working beyond their borders. So by the time someone comes to your border, in a sense, it's too late. So you have to always be working beyond your borders. And I think this is something which comes up very clear in all the papers around us. Today, I think the Middle East is involved in what is not dissimilar to the 30-year wars in Europe, which the Treaty of Westphalia was supposed to stop. The problem was that each country intervened inside another country to help its co-religionists. And this was what the Treaty of Westphalia put an end to, saying whose region, his religion. That means the religion of the state is the religion of the prince ruling the state. And this is precisely what is being contravened in the Middle East today. Everybody is in everybody else's pockets. So that is a problem. It is an anti-Westphalian, it's against Westphalian norms, but it is the norm or the fact in the Middle East. And I think in this sense, the Middle East presents us a different set of cases for rethinking the UN Westphalian system. Are we away from the norm, and should we go back to the norm either through war, imposition or by force or by treaty, or should we think about this as the norm, as the actual operating conditions of the international system today, which is at odds with the Westphalian setup of the United Nations? And in that sense, I think there's a lot of work for us to do as scholars, looking at how things actually work in ways which may be different from the way the international system is set up in the UN. So I think that's very important work for us to do, and I think all our work on Saudi Arabia gives us a very good basis for doing that. I would just say one last thing about, I wasn't here unfortunately this morning, but the paper on Saudi participation in the Cold War and so on. From working with my students, I see that there was not only a Arabian-Afghan dimension to the Cold War participation of Saudi Arabia and the Islamists it mobilized in Afghanistan. There are at least two other axes as well. There's an axis which goes between Saudi Arabia and Taiwan. When the Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalists, lost to the communists in 1949, there were Chinese Muslims as well who were actually allied militarily with Chiang Kai-shek, who went out of China. Basically, they were evacuated actually by the Americans, went to Cairo, went to Saudi Arabia. Many of them settled in Saudi Arabia. And they then went on to play roles in, number one, pilgrimage, bringing Chinese pilgrims to Saudi, but also work with Taiwan and the US as another vector of Islam in the Cold War, in the communism versus capitalism Cold War. So that second vector. There is, I think, a third vector, and Serkan I think works on this. There is a third vector which shows how actually from Turkey into Central Asia, the decline of the Soviet Union also meant that Turkey was able to send out a vector into Central Asia, which basically, you could say, gobbled up the hollowing out parts of the Soviet Empire. And I think that's quite significant, not really well known, that story, but what that means, one of the consequences of that is that this vector was considered successful. Taking Central Asia out of the Soviet Union was considered very successful. The Turks had a big hand in it. And I think this success of this vector of Islam and the US versus communism, the success of this vector meant that the US was, in this dimension, very comfortable with Islamism. And so comfortable, I speculate, that they gave the green light to Islamists taking over the government of Turkey. And that is to me one of the biggest achievements in the post-Cold War period, because what that means is a deep military state, a US client military state, was actually turned over to civilian rule. This has not happened in Pakistan, has not happened in Thailand, hasn't happened in Indonesia, I would say. And so one of these deeply militarized states, as a US ally, to go away from being a militarized state is a big achievement, and it is a big achievement of Turkey. And that achievement, I would say, is not understandable if you don't understand this dimension of the Cold War and the ending of the Cold War and the role of Islamists in the ending of this Cold War. So I'll just leave it at that, just to say that the importance of understanding the international, transnational dimensions of engagement are very important to understand the major developments within each country today. And I think your work in Saudi Arabia has given us a very good basis for rethinking how the outside and the inside work together. Thank you.